Taking the receiver from the harness bull, Rick said, "Mr. Bryant?" He listened, waited. Nothing. "I'll dial again." The phone rang, but no one answered it. "Let me try," Officer Krams said. "You must have misdialed. Officer Krams calling in. Is there an Inspector Bryant connected with the department?" "Well, what about a bounty hunter named Rick Deckard?" "You're sure? Could he have recently—" Oh, I see. Okay, thanks. No, I have it under control." Officer Krams rang off, turned toward Rick. "I had him on the line," Rick said. "I talked to him. He said he'd talk to you. It must be phone trouble." "I have Miss Luff's statement, Deckard, so let's go down to the Hall of Justice so I can book you." "Okay," Rick said. "I'm anxious to get to the Hall of Justice. This matter should be straightened out." Officer Krams deftly frisked him and came up with Rick's service pistol and laser tube. He appropriated both after sniffing the muzzle of the pistol. "This has been fired recently." "I retired an Andy just now," Rick said. "The remains are still in my car, up on the roof." "Okay," Officer Krams said. "We'll go have a look." He nudged Rick forward and, together, the two of them ascended by elevator to the roof of the Opera House. Opening the door of Rick's car, Officer Krams inspected the body of Polikov. "An android," Rick said. "I was sent after him. He almost got me, pretending to be—" "They'll take your statement at the Hall of Justice," Officer Krams interrupted. He nudged Rick over to the police car. With the two of them aboard, the patrol car zoomed up and headed south. Something, Rick noticed, was not as it should be. "The Hall of Justice," he said, "is north, on Lombard." "That's the old Hall of Justice," Officer Krams said. "The new one is on Mission. That old building, nobody's used that for years." The Mission Street Hall of Justice building struck Rick Deckard as attractive, except for one aspect. He had never seen it before. A few minutes later, he found himself being booked. "It makes no sense," he said to himself. "Who are these people? If this place has always existed, why didn't we know about it? And why don't they know about us?" A man, not in uniform, approached Rick Deckard. "What's this one?" he asked. "Suspected homicide," Krams answered. "We have a body. We found in his car, but he claims it's an android. We're giving it a bone marrow analysis in the lab, and posing as a bounty hunter to gain access to a woman's dressing room in order to ask her suggestive questions. She doubted he was what he said he was and called us in. You want to finish up with him, sir?" "All right." The senior police official eyed Rick and reached for Rick's briefcase. "What do you have in here, Mr. Deckard?" "Material pertaining to the Voight-Kampff personality test. I was testing a suspect when Officer Krams arrested me." He watched as the police official rummaged through the contents of the briefcase. "The questions I asked Miss Luff are standard VK questions printed on the—" "Do you know George Gleason and Phil Resch?" the police official asked. "No," Rick said. "They're the bounty hunters of Northern California. Both are attached to our department. Maybe you'll run into them while you're here. Are you an android, Mr. Deckard? The reason I ask is we've had escaped Andys turn up posing as out-of-state bounty hunters here in pursuit of a suspect." "I'm not an android. You can administer the Voight-Kampff test to me. I've taken it before. Can I phone my wife?" "You're allowed one call. Would you rather phone her than a lawyer?" "I'll phone my wife. She can get a lawyer for me." The plainclothes officer handed him a 50-cent piece. Rick dialed his home phone number and stood for what seemed like an eternity, waiting. A woman's face appeared on the vidscreen.
"Hello?"
she said. It was not Iran. He had never seen the woman before in his life. He hung up, walked slowly back to the police officer. "Here's your briefcase," the officer said. "Come into my office. I'd like to talk with you further." He started down the hall, leading the way. "My name is Garland," the police officer said. He held out his hand and they shook, briefly. "Sit down," Garland said as he opened his office door. "This Voight-Kampff test that you mentioned, all that material you carry, it's an analytical tool for detecting Andys?" "It's our basic test, the only one we currently employ, the only one capable of distinguishing the new Nexus 6 brain unit. You haven't heard of this test?" "I've heard of several profile analysis scales for use with androids, but not that one." He continued to study Rick intently. "Those smudged carbon flimsies that you have in your briefcase, Polikov, Miss Luft, your assignments. The next one is me." Rick stared at him, then grabbed for the briefcase. In a moment the carbons lay spread out before him. Garland had told the truth. It's an unpleasant sensation, Garland said. To find yourself a bounty hunter's assignment all of a sudden, or whatever it is you are, Deckard. He pressed the key on his desk intercom. Send one of the bounty hunters in here. I don't care which one. Okay, thank you. Phil Resch will be in here in a minute or so from now, he said to Rick. I want to see his list before I proceed. You think I might be on his list? Rick said. It's possible. We'll know pretty soon. Best to be sure about these critical matters. The office door opened and a tall man wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a fuzzy Van Dyke beard appeared. Garland rose. Phil Resch, Rick Deckard. You're both bounty hunters and it's probably time you met. Which city are you attached to? Phil Resch said as he shook hands with Rick. Garland answered. San Francisco. Here, take a look at his schedule. This one comes up next. He handed Phil Resch the sheet which Rick Deckard had been examining. Say, Gar, this is you. There's more. He's also got Luba Luft, the opera singer, on his list, and Polikov. Remember Polikov? He's now dead. This bounty hunter, or android, or whatever he is, got him. We're running a bone marrow test. Polikov I've talked to, Phil Resch said. Luba Luft I've never met, although I've heard records she's made. To Rick he said, Did you test her out? I started to, but I couldn't get an accurate reading, and she called in a harness pull which ended it. What test do you use? Phil Resch asked. The Void Kampf scale. I don't know that particular one. I've always said that the best place for an android would be with a big police organization such as WPO. Ever since I first met Polikov, I wanted to test him, but no pretext ever arose. It never would have either, which is one of the values such a spot would have for an enterprising android. The intercom came on.
Inspector Garland, the lab report on Mr. Polikov's corpse is ready.
Let's have it, Miss French.
The bone marrow test shows that Mr. Polikov was a humanoid robot. Do you want a detailed...
Nah, that's enough. Garland settled back in his seat, grimly contemplating the far wall. He said nothing. Resch said, What is the basis of your Void Kampf test, Mr. Deckard? Empathic response, in a variety of social situations, mostly having to do with animals. Ours is probably simpler, Resch said. The reflex arc response taking place in the upper ganglia of the spinal column requires several microseconds more in the humanoid robot than in the human nervous system. We use an audio signal, or light flash. The subject presses a button, and the elapsed time is measured. We try it a number of times, of course. Elapsed time varies both in Andy and the human, but by the time 10 reactions have been measured, we believe we have a reliable clue. You can test me out, Rick said. I'm ready. Of course, I'd like to test you, too, if you're willing. Naturally, Resch said. He was, however, studying Inspector Garland. I've said for years that the Bonelli reflex arc test should be applied routinely to police personnel. The higher up the chain of command, the better. Haven't I, Inspector? That's right, you have, Garland said. And I've always opposed it, on the grounds that it would lower department morale. I think now, Rick said, you're going to have to sit still for it, in view of your lab's report on Polikov. I guess so, Garland said. He jabbed a finger at Phil Resch. But I'm warning you, you're not going to like the results of the tests. Do you know what they'll be? Resch asked. I know almost to a hair, Inspector Garland said. Okay, Resch nodded. I'll go upstairs and get the Bonelli gear. I'll be back in 3 or 4 minutes. Reaching into the top right-hand drawer of his desk, Inspector Garland fumbled about, then brought forth a laser tube. He swiveled it at Rick. That's not going to make any difference, Rick said. Resch will have a post-mortem run on me, the same as your lab ran on Polikov, and he'll insist on the Bonelli test on himself and on you. By degrees, Garland lowered the laser beam. Then he shrugged and returned it to the desk drawer. What will the test on the 3 of us show? Rick asked. That damn fool Resch, Garland said. He actually doesn't know? He doesn't know. He doesn't suspect. He doesn't have the slightest idea. Otherwise, he couldn't live out his life as a bounty hunter, a human occupation, hardly an android occupation. Garland gestured toward Rick's briefcase. Those other carbons, the other suspects you're supposed to test and retire, we all came here together on the same ship from Mars. Not Resch. He stayed behind another week, receiving the synthetic memory system. What'll he do when he finds out? I don't have the foggiest idea. He may kill me. Kill himself. Maybe you too. Your position would be better if Phil Resch could pass the Bonelli test, if it was just me. That way, the results would be predictable. To Resch, I'd just be another Andy to retire as soon as possible. So you're not in a good position either, Deckard. Almost as bad, in fact, as I am.